Terrorist Fighters Legislation Bill introduction.
The bill is set down for first reading forthwith.
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Christopher Finlayson.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Right Honourable the Prime Minister, I move that the Countering Terrorist Fighters Legislation Bill be now read a first time. I nominate the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee to consider the bill. At the appropriate time, I intend to move that the bill be reported by Tuesday 2 December 2014 and that the committee have authority to meet at any time while the House is sitting, except during oral questions, during any evening on a day on which there has been a set sitting of the House, and on a Friday in a week in which there has been a sitting of the House. Mr Speaker, this omnibus bill responds to the rapid evolution of the threat posed by foreign terrorist fighters and other violent extremists in the West. These are not New Zealand's problems alone, but New Zealand is not immune from them. As the Prime Minister outlined in his speech at Victoria University a few weeks ago, agencies have a watch list of between 30 and 40 people of concern in the foreign fighter context, with another 30 to 40 requiring further investigation. Our independently assessed domestic threat level was recently increased from very low to low. A terrorist attack is possible, but not likely. Other governments in Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom and elsewhere have now sought to amend their legislation in this area. All governments are very mindful of that once dreadful boast of the IRA: the terrorists only have to be lucky once. Mr Speaker, we're doing so too, not only in line with what is happening in similar countries, but in line with the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2178, which urged member states to restrict the movement on foreign terrorist fighters and ensure that their legislation is up to scratch. The government agreed to a targeted review covering 4 narrow and targeted areas. First, the capacity, the capabilities and statutory powers of the NZSIS to investigate and monitor suspected and returning foreign terrorist fighters and other violent extremists. Secondly, the government's statutory powers to restrict and disrupt the ability of suspected foreign terrorist fighters to travel to conflict zones. Thirdly, whether specific criminal offences should be introduced to address these areas. The review did not recommend, sir, any changes to criminal offences at this time. What we're left with is a narrowly focused set of changes which will ensure the SIS has the tools it requires to address the foreign terrorist fighter threat to our land. Mr Speaker, before I turn to the main provisions of the bill, I want to say something about the legislative context. At the end of the debate, I will move that the bill be reported to the House by Tuesday 2 December. This allows, obviously, a much shorter time in a select committee than is usual. The reason for this, of course, is the urgent nature of the review and the fact that we must make a number of changes to legislation now. The bill was provided to a number of organisations late last week, including the New Zealand Law Society and the Legislation Advisory Committee. The government has been particularly concerned to ensure other parties receive briefings about the review and legislation early and to whatever extent they have required. Mr Speaker, the bill has a sunset clause. Now, there's been some comment about the date of that sunset clause, but we have to acknowledge that there is going to be a comprehensive review of all this legislation, which must begin no later than June 2013. Any changes recommended in that review, and hopefully they'd be able to be enforced by, say, the end of 2016, will supersede what we're debating today. The legislative product of that review will have a full Select Committee hearing, and I know the Select Committee will do a very good job on the present legislation in the time it has available. In the time I have remaining, I want to turn to some of the proposed changes. Colleagues of mine who follow me can go into these areas in greater detail. In line with USSC Resolution 2178, the changes proposed fall into two categories: restricting and disrupting travel, and monitoring and investigating foreign terrorist fighters. In the first area, the bill allows the Minister of Internal Affairs to set a cancellation period of up to 3 years rather than the current 12-month period. This would only occur in a situation where the Minister is satisfied that the person poses or continues to pose a danger to New Zealand or any other country. It also allows the temporary suspension of a passport or travel document for no more than 10 working days. In the second area, sir, the bill provides the SIS with the ability under warrant to undertake visual surveillance in a private setting or involving trespass onto a private property. It's modelled on the existing powers in the Search and Surveillance Act 2012. It's nothing really that the police in special circumstances can't do already. I want particularly to refer to Clause 9. These deal with intelligence collection and visual surveillance for a period of no more than 48 hours in situations of emergency or urgency. And I think, sir, these are the provisions that have caused or generated the most comment to date. On one level, what is proposed here is nothing new. A similar regime for surveillance without a warrant in situations of emergency or urgency was contained in the Search and Surveillance Act 2012. I've had a good look at that section, and I've suggested that what is proposed in this bill contain more safeguards. The oversight and protections proposed in this bill are far more extensive than those in the Search and Surveillance Act. So, for example, the regime would be subject to ministerial oversight, and the Minister must be informed within 12 hours. Any information collected must be destroyed if that's what the Minister directs, and the Inspector General must be notified of authorisations, and the annual report has to set all this information out. So can I give you, sir, a hypothetical example of where such a power could be required? Say reporting indicated that later today an individual was planning to depart New Zealand to travel to Syria. That individual had previously been unknown to the SIS, but new reporting indicated the individual had boasted to others about going on a jihad. There'd be insufficient time to get the traditional warrant together in the 8 hours before the individual left the country and bring together the Minister and the Commissioner for Warrants. In this hypothetical case, an emergency authorisation could enable the intercept of communications so an assessment could be made of the threat and potentially support the cancellation of the individual's passport. I, and where appropriate the Commissioner, may direct the NZSIS to discontinue that activity under the authorisation and destroy any information. Mr. Speaker, I acknowledge, however, that any expansion of the powers of the state in this critical area must be very carefully thought through, and a number of people who will make submissions will, I'm sure, have genuine concerns. So I approach these provisions with an open mind. I want the Select Committee to look very closely at them and to consider any additional safeguards it thinks that are useful. Mr. Speaker, I commend the bill to the House. I thank members, particularly members of the Labour Party, for their engagement to date, and I emphasise, sir, that I'm open to discussions with Mr. Little or any of his team on any of these matters, because I think that in relation to Clause 9, it's critically important that we get it as right as we can. Sir, I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thank the Minister